Welcome to the second season of Coffee and Conflict, the National Security Institute's literary podcast, where I welcome leading experts to discuss their research, their books, and the most pressing defense and foreign policy issues of the day. I'm your host, Joshua Huminski, a senior fellow at NSI and senior vice president at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. So grab your first or second coffee of the day and let's begin. I'm joined today by Ankit Panda. He is the Stanton Senior Fellow in the Nuclear Policy Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. His research interests include nuclear strategy, escalation, missiles, missile defense, space security, and U.S. alliances. No small subjects there at all. He's the editor-at-large at The Diplomat, where he hosts the Asia Geopolitics podcast, and a contributing editor at War on the Rocks, where he hosts Thinking the Unthinkable with Ankit Panda, a podcast on nuclear matters, and a very good one, if I may say so. He's also the author of The New Nuclear Age, The Precipice of Armageddon, which we're going to discuss today, as well as Indo-Pacific Missile Arsenals, Kim Jong-un and the Bomb, and New Approaches to Verifying and Monitoring North Korea's Nuclear Arsenal. He joins me today, and I'm delighted to host him on Welcome to Coffee and Conflict.
Thank you so much for having me, Joshua. It's a pleasure to join you.
Well, I'm delighted to host you. We were hoping to host you earlier, but unfortunately some scheduling difficulties interceded, so I apologize. But I really want to jump straight into the title of the book, The New Nuclear Age, and At the Precipice of Armageddon, which, frankly, Coffee and Conflict is the title of the show, but I'm thinking we might need something a little bit stronger to jump in with this one. But what is the new nuclear age, and how does it differ from previous nuclear ages?
Yeah, sure. I think that's a great place to start. And look, I mean, the book does argue that something has meaningfully changed in terms of the role that nuclear weapons play in international politics and global statecraft. Right, nuclear weapons didn't go away at the end of the Cold War, but they certainly receded in terms of the shadow they cast over our world, and I think that was quite literally captured with the reciprocal reductions between the United States and the Russian Federation throughout the 1990s. Which kind of, to answer your question more directly, the Cold War being that first nuclear age, right? The Trinity test in 1945 all the way to December 91 being that first part of the global nuclear age that we sort of think about. The second nuclear age, as Colin Gray, Paul Bracken, and others sort of talked about, was that sort of thematic shift where we started worrying a lot more about things like nuclear terrorism, proliferation to so-called rogue states around the world. And now, as I argue in my book, beginning with the 2020s, we have turned a page now into a third nuclear age. My publisher wouldn't let me call the book the third nuclear age because it presupposed that anybody reading the book would know what the first two were. So I called it a new nuclear age. What's new this time? I think there's two combinations here. One being far greater multipolarity and multipolar linkages between the countries that possess nuclear weapons and even advanced non-nuclear states that can drive the pace and tempo of nuclear escalation in a variety of regions, both in the Euro-Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific. But in addition to that, we also have, I think, a very rapidly changing cocktail of technologies that bear increasingly on the nuclear balance. Now, I should note here that each of these, particularly technological change, isn't meaningfully new as a theme, right? Technological change was endemic to the first nuclear age. I like to point out that, shortly after the invention of the atomic bomb, the information age, the missile age, the space age, all of these begin accelerating. You have the U.S. Air Force by the late 1950s is thinking about the effects of computation on nuclear stability. And, here we are in 2025 talking about artificial intelligence and the like, and the potential for these new technologies to upend nuclear stability. But the argument that I try to make in the book is that it's precisely the intersection between multipolar competition, growing great power strife between the U.S., Russia, and China, and the simultaneous change in level of military integration that we're seeing with a number of new technologies that makes this third new nuclear age uniquely more dangerous and complex than either of the previous nuclear ages. And so I sort of point out, how we got here, why we got here, and what we might do about it.
This book is absolutely fantastic. It was a very, very quick read, and I highly recommend it because there's so much in here that I really want to dive into.
Yeah.
I guess I want to start with, if we go to the technological component aspect of it, because it's gotten a lot of attention as of late. President Putin was out there recently talking about the Buderev-esque nuclear-powered cruise missile, the Poseidon nuclear torpedo. And it seems that we're coming full circle to almost these Doctor Strange-Lovian type weapons and systems all over again. But how is the technology before, specifically about the Russian component, how is the technology reshaping these dynamics? And you talk about how the technological evolution isn't fundamentally new, but now we're talking about hypersonic glide vehicles, fractional orbital bombardment systems, and new technologies, and also old technologies applied in new ways.
Yeah. So, look, I mean, in the book, I present a framework in the chapter on technology, right? So, technological change is neither good nor bad for nuclear stability. It really depends on the effects of a given that a given technology has on the nuclear balance. And here we have to talk about, what renders nuclear deterrence most stable. Here I'm not necessarily thinking from like a U.S. perspective, just from a strategic interactions perspective. If two countries have nuclear weapons, the deterrence relationship between them is generally thought to be most stable when both sides have survivable second strike capabilities, right? So, why are the Russians now building these, as you put it nicely, I think, strange Lovian weapons, doomsday weapons, super weapons, as they're sometimes called in the media? I sort of tell journalists that, super weapons is not my favorite descriptor. But the essential driver of these systems, Burevestnik, the kind of extremely long endurance cruise missile, the Poseidon underwater torpedo, the avant-garde intercontinental range hypersonic glide vehicle. These are all about defeating missile defenses, right? And in a way, at least two of those systems, the avant-garde and the Poseidon, trace their origins back to the Strategic Defense Initiative in the 1980s, when the Soviet Union worried about the United States potentially escaping the condition of vulnerability that renders nuclear deterrence more stable. So it's this cat and mouse game where our adversaries want to make sure that they will have some assured ability to retaliate against the United States. And so in the Western discourse, I think we sometimes will describe these weapons as destabilizing. And there's a lot I don't like about these capabilities, right? I don't think we should be encouraging a world where countries feel like they need to build nuclear-powered cruise missiles with exotic nuclear reactors on board that can cause a tremendous amount of, radiological pollution if they explode or detonate unexpectedly. But here we are. So I think it's just a very good example of the return of qualitative arms racing dynamics in addition to quantitative arms racing dynamics. And all of this happened before the United States even overtly declared an intention to pursue a Golden Dome, which, as of this January, is U.S. policy. So I would expect these problems will get worse before they get better. And it's not just going to be the Russians, right? I think with China, you're going to see, I think, a turn towards different types of delivery systems, potentially even with the North Koreans, who I continuously, warn we should not be misjudging or underestimating because they will surprise us. For adversaries, I think that is the gold standard. They need to have the assurance that they will be able to penetrate whatever missile defense and have an assured capability to retaliate, because without that assured capability to retaliate, they really don't have a robust nuclear deterrent capability vis-a-vis the United States.
I want to stick with the United States for a second because we're recording this now about sort of the middle of November. The end of last month, President Trump seemed to announce on Truth Social, they got a lot of traction in social media, that the United States was reconsidering resuming nuclear weapons testing, which is something it hasn't done for quite some time and has sort of been an international norm. What is your thinking that was driving behind this, and what are the implications if the United States actually goes through with this for strategic stability, future arms control negotiations, and just sort of the deterrence equation?
Yeah, so I'm really happy to talk about this because, in not to spoil the book for listeners, but in the final chapter where I try to present some ideas on how we can prevent things from getting worse, one of the things I emphasize is not returning to a world of nuclear testing, right? And so I have a lot of thoughts on this. The North Koreans are the only country to have detonated nuclear explosive devices in the 21st century. So the first place to begin is by talking about, nuclear testing does not mean the same thing to everybody. So when President Trump says nuclear testing, I think most people are imagining full-scale, supercritical, full-yield nuclear detonation. So these are, for lay people, when you imagine a mushroom cloud detonating, that is the kind of explosive test that I'm talking about. So that is kind of what nuclear test means to most people. There's been this kind of arcane arms control compliance dispute between, that the United States has levied against China and Russia for a number of years, which is that China and Russia have been carrying out what the U.S. says are nuclear experiments that are inconsistent with what the United States interprets to be the zero yield standard in the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. So this is, let me unpack that a little bit. So what the United States does and has been doing since 1992 are subcritical nuclear tests. So the National Nuclear Security Administration oversees a series of experiments to keep the U.S. nuclear stockpile safe, secure, and effective. These involve experiments where conventional explosives will, implode a nuclear pit without producing a supercritical self-sustaining chain reaction. So that's a subcritical nuclear test, and we deem that to be essentially compatible with what the United States agreed was the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty's intent. We've signed that treaty, we haven't ratified it, but the U.S. essentially treats that as the basis for its own moratorium. Russia and China, the U.S. has alleged, don't do this. So they carry out tests that are very similar, but they do produce a very small supercritical fissile yield. So not a full-scale explosion, right? But basically like on the order of a fraction of a few pounds of TNT equivalent release. So when I read what President Trump said, and then, he did an interview with CBS, it did seem like to me that he has somehow caught on to this compliance dispute, because he was, especially when he talked to the anchor on CBS, he was talking about how the Russians and the Chinese do these very small tests that we can't detect or fully understand. And so the U.S. needs to test by equal measure. He's implied that there should be parity. So that kind of is where I am right now. I don't know if the president really means that the United States should resume full-scale explosive testing. That would be, I think, very harmful to U.S. interests. But if the U.S. does do what we've alleged the Russians and the Chinese are doing, which are what are known as hydronuclear tests, these kind of very small explosions, that's very different. It would, I think, still cause controversy and compliance disputes with both the Russians and the Chinese, who then might, throw recriminations towards the United States. I think it'd be a good idea for actually the U.S., Russia, and China to sit down and have a conversation about what zero-yield testing means. But we've never done that. I think geopolitical realities make that far too difficult today. But I just can't imagine that, even this administration will deem full-scale explosive testing to be in U.S. interests. I mean, there's so many reasons not to do this. I mean, leaving aside the fact that since 1992, one of the fastest-growing metropolitan areas in the United States has been Las Vegas, which is next to the Nevada National Security Site. So you couldn't really test without a tremendous political firestorm in Nevada. But also testing, we have more than 1,000 tests of data. The Soviet Union had, I think, 715 from the Cold War, and the Chinese only have 45. And so in a world where the U.S. tests, it becomes permissible then for the Russians, the Chinese, the Indians, the Pakistanis to return to testing. And each of those countries has far more to gain at the margins from a new nuclear test than the United States would.
Well, you mentioned there about the possibility of getting the People's Republic of China, Russia, the United States in an idealized situation to sit down and talk about what a zero yield test means. But what is your thinking on the nuclear trilemma and the possibility of arms control in this new dynamic where you have the United States and former Soviet Union, now Russia, being the two big nuclear powers around which all sort of arms control has existed? And then you have this new actor of the People's Republic of China, which is rapidly modernizing its arsenal, building an entirely new arsenal, but also blurring the offensive and defensive command and control capabilities that govern both their conventional and strategic systems. And I have to mention the bouncy castles of death, because I just think that is a delightful term, even though it's really a precursor for a horrible thing. But what is the possibility of having Beijing, Moscow, and Washington sit down? I mean, is that any prospect of that?
So I think the prospects are pretty dim. President Trump has spoken about this. The Chinese for the longest time haven't categorically ruled this out, but they've said that the Russians and the United States have a unique obligation to reduce down to China's levels before the Chinese would consider joining a process like that, right? And so what does that mean in practice? Some people in Washington call China a near peer of the United States, but that's still, I think, a bit of an overemphasis, because even if by the mid-2030s, as the U.S. intelligence community expects, China will have an aggregate warhead stockpile of 1,500, that's still a fraction of what the United States and Russia have between their deployed and non-deployed reserve capabilities, which, might be uploaded after New START ends in just 3 months from now. So pretty unlikely that is going to be the basis, right, for three-way talks. The other thing we have to talk about here is that, this is a problem that can be solved in the generic sense, right? If you, if I just kind of, don't use the names U.S., Russia, and China, just imagine nuclear states A, B, and C, You can solve this problem of trilateral strategic stability if all three of these countries have assured retaliation postures, right? The only thing they care about with their nuclear forces is retaliating for nuclear attacks and nothing else. And the political relationships between A, B, and C are symmetrical. And that, of course, does not at all describe the reality between the US, Russia, and China, right? Russia and China are not allies, but they are partners, and they collaborate in some exceptionally sensitive areas to include early warning capabilities. And the US, Russia, and China have completely disparate nuclear strategies and roles for their nuclear forces. And here I'd actually draw attention to the United States, right? I actually think part of the reason it is so difficult for us to get to three-way arms control or strategic stability is because we in the United States have a grand strategy, and for essentially the last 60 plus years, we have seen the role of our nuclear weapons as not only contributing to the defense of the defense of the homeland against nuclear attacks. Certainly, U.S. weapons do that, but we have 34 treaty allies to whom we extend deterrence around the world. 31 NATO partners. The French have their own nukes. The South Koreans, the Japanese, the Australians, and in order for the United States to do that, we of course see a value in counterforce targeting, right? So targeting the nuclear forces of our adversaries and seeking to, as a result, limit damage against the United States and our allies in a nuclear conflict. The Russians do this to an extent. They do incorporate counterforce targeting, particularly against U.S. ICBM silos. But China, as far as we know, does not think about nuclear weapons targeting or employment in this way. In fact, China is the only country on Earth today that still fields megaton-class weapons because they do view the prospect of retaliation against population centers to still contribute to deterrence. And they still have a no first use declaratory posture. So counterforce targeting, combined with the fact that Russia and China are collaborating, makes it very difficult for the United States to actually crack this nut, right? Because American planners have to consider Russia and China colluding in a nuclear war. And if you care about counterforce targeting and you're worried about collusion between two superpower adversaries, you have to take into account the totality of the target set that you might have to hold at risk. And so this is what's going to drive, I think, American requirements for nuclear forces upwards, right? And, we're in a modernization process that's going to result in some pretty unfavorable changes, I think, to the U.S. force posture, right? Like just to point out one example, with the planned modernization of the sea leg of the U.S. force from the Ohio-class submarines to the Columbia-class, we're losing a whole bunch of submarine tubes, right? So I think we're going down from around 336 to 192, if I have those numbers right. And that's precisely at the moment where China's building up, and our fixed ICBMs, the Sentinel in the future, Minuteman III today, are undesirable for China-based targeting because they have to overfly Russia. So there's all of these kind of problems now that are, I think, bedeviling American nuclear strategists. There are, I think, multiple ways for the United States to resolve this, and you've sort of seen the debate play out in Washington. I can share my own view, but I mean, just to capture the tenor of this debate, on the one hand, you have people who argue for the status quo U.S. nuclear strategy premised on counterforce and damage limitation, who inevitably, I think, end up concluding that you will need more because the number of targets is increasing and the prospect of political collusion between Russia and China is increasing. On the other hand, you have those who make the argument that the U.S. should actually fundamentally rethink its nuclear strategy, and maybe move towards, if not counter value, then a more restrained form of nuclear targeting. My view is somewhere in the middle, which is that, I think the way I think about counterforce is that as undesirable as counterforce is in a crisis, where I do think it generates crisis stability problems, creating incentives for our adversaries to use nuclear weapons earlier, the peacetime and wartime benefits, I think, still do, on balance, shake out in favor of the United States. But the only way to compete effectively, looking at our defense industrial base constraints, our conventional priorities, our missile defense policy, taking our nuclear strategy in aggregate as part of U.S. grand strategy, will, I think, require the United States to adapt its status quo nuclear strategy to a world where we inevitably have to accept more risk in sort of trying to deter two-peer adversaries, especially if we ever hope to use arms control again to sort of limit the scale of problems that we have to plan against. And that is one of the core functions of arms control that I think sometimes gets forgotten, right? During the Cold War, we expressly used arms control to make our nuclear planning lives a little bit more tractable.
Oh, it's fascinating you mentioned that, because it seems, correct me if I'm wrong, that Washington in many ways is having to relearn those sort of lessons of Cold War deterrence, Cold War strategy, nuclear planning, from that sort of second nuclear age after like the collapse of the Soviet Union through to certainly where we are today, the muscle memory sort of atrophied because it was about counter proliferation. It was about securing loose nukes. It was about preventing terrorists from getting their hands on fissile material. And now we're at a situation where we have strategic peer and near peer adversaries that are reintroducing these sorts of questions into the muscle memory. How is Washington coming to grips with this in your view?
Yeah, so you're 100% right. I mean, this is basically one of the core reasons I wrote this book, right? So this book is designed for somebody, if you're at the Pentagon, you spend the last 20 years of your life thinking about counterterrorism, and you don't know what a nuclear weapon is, you don't know where to start. The hope is that, this book provides something of a one-stop resource to kind of wrap your head around all of these difficult debates that are now playing out. But I think you're absolutely right that this is something that has happened on, I think, a massive scale across the entirety of the national security world in the United States. And don't even get me started on the allies, who I think are very much starting to come to grips with this as well. I mean, there's that old NATO term that started getting used after, I think it was 2015 or 2016, after the Russian annexation of Crimea, that NATO needed to improve its so-called nuclear IQ. It's not a term I love, but the argument I often make is that, it's actually not just the NATO allies, it's actually, we here in the United States. I mean, it's not just, planners, military officers, policymakers. It's even, the general public, members of Congress. I mean, it's really remarkable if you go back and you look at the congressional debates over the Strategic Defense Initiative, right, in the 1980s under the Reagan administration. I mean, members of Congress knew what strategic stability meant in sort of a broad sense, right? So you have these impassioned debates about missile defense that are, I think, fascinating and sort of unimaginable in the current context. And I think there's also a generational angle to this, right? You have a younger generation of Americans that came of age in a very different world, a world where nuclear weapons were not front and center, now having to sort of recontend with the challenges that nuclear deterrence poses for U.S. strategy and national interests. So, long story short, I think this is going to require a lot of active investment. It's going to require, efforts by those of us on the outside. I mean, anybody in academia kind of inoculating the next generation of minds in international relations or security studies is going to have to recenter nuclear weapons in their curricula. And I think professional military education is going to have to center this as well. In the course of researching my book, I found that there was a big shift in the kinds of things that PME focused on when it came to nuclear issues. So CWMD, counterproliferation, as you said, big focus. Non-proliferation, big focus during the second nuclear age. Missile defense to an extent. But now it's like these old conversations about missile defense, about allied proliferation, about, counterforce versus countervalue and damage limitation. All of these debates, I think, are very much roaring back in a big way. And there's not that many people that are really equipped intellectually to really jump into the deep end of some of these conversations. And so I think we need a full-scale revitalization of nuclear literacy efforts in the United States to get better policy outcomes here.
It's interesting you mentioned just sort of the NATO allies in particular, because in the context of the war in Ukraine, we've seen the brandishment by President Putin of the nuclear threat, either attacking Ukraine or the potential detonation of a nuclear weapon to demonstrate resolve. But then also at the same time, you've also had a changing relationship between the United States and NATO under President Trump, primarily rhetorically, but there have been questions that have been raised as a follow-on from that about the extended deterrence, which you mentioned earlier on, about the treaty commitments that we have. How do you see Europe in particular, the European member states of NATO, sort of grappling with this question? I mean, you mentioned the French deterrent, you mentioned the British continuous at sea deterrent. How is this changing? And we have a pressure from Russia, which is clearly using it as a threat and knows that it works as a threat, but also the United States introducing some doubts, however realistic, into the minds of these member states.
Yeah, so look, I mean, I finalized the manuscript for the book right before the U.S. presidential election last year, and in the last year, I mean, we're in November 2025, so it's almost exactly been a year since I finalized the manuscript. It's been breathtaking. I mean, I've been traveling to Europe. I've been engaging with various schools of European thought on what to do about this moment. I was just in Paris, Berlin, and London in October, so a lot of these reflections are quite fresh, but I think the Europeans fundamentally recognize that we are in a new world. You cannot go back to the way things were with the United States. It's a problem that's far deeper than this administration and this moment in transatlantic relations. I think there's a broader sense that Washington. I mean, you could also think about kind of the intellectual underpinnings of American strategy during the Cold War, like George Kennan to Paul Nitze to Brzezinski, all of these, Henry Kissinger, all of these guys. I mean, a post Second World War generation of American thinkers that very much recognized that transatlantic links really were the core of how the United States would seek to pursue its interests on the other hemisphere, right? We were a Western Hemisphere oriented country, and then we got pulled into, two world wars, and the fundamental contours of American strategy in the latter half of the 20th century changed as a result. Today, I think it's extremely different. I mean, Europeans look at a younger generation of Americans extremely jaded in many ways about the exercise of American power abroad. Some of these figures, like Elbridge Colby, J.D. Vance, are now playing an important role in the second Trump administration. But by another measure, I think Europeans also see a new generation of Americans that fundamentally look out onto the world, not over the Atlantic Ocean, but over the Pacific, towards the Indo-Pacific, towards competition with China. And so, long story short, I think inexorably, I think the Europeans are going to be heading in the direction of carrying more of the burden for their own security. And the interesting question is, what does that mean in practice, right? And so you have these raging debates now in Europe, from Germany to Poland, in Warsaw, the Nordic states, the Baltic states, about, independent nuclear deterrence, French and British deterrent, forces playing more of a role in European security, trying to offset nuclear weapons with conventional deterrence. There's a very kind of rich, I think, intellectual renaissance underway in Europe on these issues. But there's also a lot of, I think, debates that are grounded fundamentally in just fear and uncertainty about this moment. And so I would describe kind of more of the pro-independent deterrent voices in that, in that term, like where there's kind of this sense that the United States is no longer reliable, but that the French and the Brits can't do what the Americans can do, and so as a result, Germany and Poland should have their own nuclear weapons, for instance. So we are in this really, really interesting moment on the European continent, but the one thing I do feel safe saying is that nobody in the continent really thinks that you can rebuild the kind of transatlantic consensus you had in the 1990s or through much of the 2000s. I think that moment is now squarely behind us, and so the task going forward is how do you build a new type of transatlantic contract, and do you do that with the second Trump administration? And if you do, is that going to be something that will be enduring, or will the United States fundamentally have a different offer to the Europeans fundamentally? And I think a lot of this will depend on, of course, what happens here in American domestic politics.
All right, sticking with that question though, because we've seen the NATO member states walk out of The Hague, agreeing to spend 5% on their GDP on defense, 3.5 and 1.5 for core, then ancillary defense spending. But we've also seen a lot of discussion on long-range precision, deep strike capabilities. We've seen Ukraine undertaking a very impressive deep strike operation using drones against Russia's strategic bomber force. Is there a risk that this conversation about holding Russian capabilities in a long-term and long, deep reach at risk could actually provoke sort of a Russian concern about the stability or security of elements of their nuclear arsenal and their strategic rocket forces?
Yeah, so absolutely. I mean, I would say, look, I think a lot of the investments that are happening in Europe right now are driven by a strong sense of political discomfort with this moment, right? And so there's a sense that the entire European security order that existed as we knew it before the COVID-19 pandemic no longer exists. It is in complete tatters, right? And so something must be done at this moment when the prospect of a conflict between NATO and Russia is greater than it has been at any point since really the 90s. And so there's a lot of investment in capability. You have the UK, German, European long-range strike approach. You have all of this talk of deep precision strike. But the conversations that I sort of had recently were interesting because when it came to actual scenarios of employment, right? So when you sort of game out, okay, so you're buying all of these capabilities. The Germans are talking about using Taurus missiles against Russian, non-strategic weapon storage sites. There are sort of two questions. I mean, first is, do political leaders in Europe have the stomach for the actual employment of these capabilities in a war? It's all fine and good to invest in these capabilities in peacetime, but there needs to be a concept of operations and a concept of employment attached to these systems. And then and there's a corollary to that, which is you need a concept of escalation management and control. And I think Europe is struggling with both of those latter categories at the moment. And so, in a general sense, I think there is this fear that the Russians do have, if they were to decide to employ non-strategic nuclear weapons, they have a form of escalation dominance against which Europe doesn't have very good answers. I would argue that this problem is not one that goes away with if the United States is sort of reattached, because I think this problem of how do you fight a limited nuclear war in Europe if the Russians decide to use non-strategic nuclear weapons is one that the U.S. doesn't have very good answers for either, right? I mean, we do have non-strategic nuclear weapons deployed in Europe, but there are so many differences, both in terms of like magazine depth and the composition of NATO non-strategic capabilities versus Russian capabilities, where they have 2,000 non-strategic nuclear weapons of a variety of types, and so a lot of this I think needs to sort of be brought back to earth, and I think this is where the really uncomfortable conversations about, some form of cooperative security building with the Russians again will have to happen, right? Like, how do you just move forward, in whatever terms the Russo-Ukrainian war might sort of resolve itself or sort of reach some kind of steady state. I think the Europeans will need to find a way to constrain and solve their Russia problems without simply depending on these offset capabilities, which are important. And I think there needs to also be, just as much as there is a focus on deterrence by denial through long-range strike, I think the Europeans need to also have some hard conversations about deterrence by denial through, building societal resiliency, investments in missile defense, force dispersal, concealment, deception, a lot of that stuff that really Europe hasn't had to think about since the Cold War.
I mean, shifting a bit towards, so I detest the idea of the CRINCs. I think it's a terrible acronym and it just sounds bad. But we see a lot of bilateral cooperation between Iran and Russia, North Korea and Russia. Certainly the Shahed drones, the artillery from North Korea and the respective drones going to Moscow. But there's a lot of concern about the knowledge transfer from Moscow to Tehran and Moscow to Pyongyang in terms of missiles, in terms of nuclear capabilities. I mean, starting just with Iran, we've seen a sea change in the sort of strategic conditions of Iran and Tehran with the Israeli strikes and the United States' Operation Midnight Hammer. How do you assess Iran and its nuclear program right now, looking at the cooperation from Russia, but also where does the program go from here? Do the Iranians double down and try to do a breakout? Are they going to go try to do some sort of agreement, or what's the next step really?
Yeah, so it's a really tough one. I mean, the first thing I'll say about the Russians is that the Russians are, by all accounts, not very good allies, right? I mean, when you really, if you're, Bashar al-Assad, or if you're the Iranians and you really need help from the Russians when things look really bad, the Russians don't tend to show up, right? And so the Iranians were kind of left to fend for themselves during Operation, Midnight Hammer in particular, and Rising Lion, which the Israelis, of course, used to great effect to impose tactical short-term setbacks, right? I mean, these were not kind of strategic setbacks to the Iranian program in the sense that they still maintain a lot of their knowledge base, even though they had their kind of command and control for their military, for the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard Corps, and the Atomic Energy Organization of Iran as well, kind of set back. But they will have the ability to reconstitute, and they are currently reconstituting. My sense is that, I'd love to be wrong about this, but the way things look, I do think another Israeli-Iranian confrontation is going to be somewhat inevitable, right? Right now, things look a lot worse than they did before the strikes in May, where you still had the International Atomic Energy Agency having access to sites like Fordo and Natanz, which we don't have any transparency into at the moment. We have highly enriched uranium that's still unaccounted for, reportedly under the rubble still. Unclear if the Iranians can access it, how quickly they can access it. Still some pretty valuable bargaining chips there. But I don't think the Iranians are in a place where they're ready to commit to a breakout. I mean, there's a complex kind of political decision-making calculus that goes into this. And breakout, to my mind, has always been kind of one of the more problematic measures. It's useful in a non-proliferation deal sense. So we talk about breakout because it was important in terms of the JCPOA, which used breakout as one of the core benchmarks against which to measure the effectiveness of the agreement. But you have to sort of ask, about deterrence itself. I mean, I wrote a book. My first book was on North Korea and kind of how the North Koreans navigated this question of how much is sufficient to deter. It's a very difficult question to answer when you're a new proliferator, particularly when your adversaries are Israel and the United States, particularly the Israelis, who have an extremely high degree of intelligence penetration into Iran and have demonstrated now the remarkable ability to maintain kind of air superiority and a very high sortie rate, despite not even being a contiguous adversary of the Iranians, right? They're separated by multiple countries. So for the Iranians, I think this question of how much is enough is certainly more than one, right? And so building a single nuclear weapon doesn't get you a deterrent. It potentially provokes even larger scale strikes in a larger conflict. And so the Iranians, I think, will have to sort of push ahead carefully. And in terms of the Russians, right, the Russians are no longer the non-proliferation actors they used to be, but they are, I think, certainly not in a place where they will see it as in their interest to promote the Iranians becoming an overt nuclear power.
I think it was fascinating. We talk about the performance of the Russians as an ally, just the performance of the Russian weapon systems in terms of air defense and whatnot. I mean, just seeing those photos of Israel refueling effectively over Tehran of just S-400, what S-400? Shifting to the east and looking at the DPRK and Pyongyang, you talk about how much deterrence is enough, and it seems that we've lost, and I say the collective, we've certainly Washington's lost a bit of attention on Pyongyang and the DPRK. President Trump had a deal with Kim Jong-un. But where does North Korea stand today in terms of its nuclear program, its nuclear capabilities? And do we risk taking our eye off the ball?
Yeah, so look, I think I've argued for a long time that the North Koreans are the third nuclear armed adversary of the United States. This used to be a very controversial statement. It's not really that controversial anymore. I mean, the Biden administration's November 2024 unclassified summary of presidential nuclear employment guidance basically concluded the same thing, right? I mean, Russia, China, North Korea were listed in the same paragraph. I think it was paragraph 3 as the three adversaries against which the United States needs to posture its nuclear forces and have various employment options for the president. That's great news if you're Kim Jong-un, right? This has been his father's and his grandfather's life work that has now kind of paid off. The North Koreans are incredibly capable. I mean, one way to think about the global nuclear order as viewed from Washington is that at the start of this decade, we had one peer, Russia. We had China, which was the so-called lesser included case of the Russia problem, right? That was the term of art used in American documents on nuclear strategy for our military planners. It was basically like, you plan for Russia, the China problem can be covered by a subset of the forces that you use to plan for Russia, and the North Koreans were a non-proliferation problem still. Now, you have one peer, one near peer, and the North Koreans are the new lesser included case. And, it's not too unlikely that by the mid-2030s, China's going to look a lot like the Russians did at the start of the 2020s in terms of their strategic forces, and the North Koreans will look a lot like China did at the start of the 2020s, right? And so it's a big shift. It is. I don't think you can tell a story about multipolarity in the third nuclear age without really centering the case of the North Koreans, right? I think the North Koreans are certainly not worth kind of just tossing to the side, right? President Nixon famously called them a fourth-rate pipsqueak of a country. And they are sure, I think, proving him wrong in a number of ways. And so the partnership, you alluded to, the Russia-North Korea treaty, very concerning, very kind of topsy-turvy proliferation dynamics with the Russians buying missiles from the North Koreans. I won't say who this was, but I spoke to a very senior former American diplomat who was involved with establishing the missile technology control regime. And so I'd spent a lot of time thinking about missile proliferation dynamics in the world. And, this person said to me, like, North Korean missiles flowing in, the hundreds into Russia, not a scenario that the United States was really, too concerned about when we sort of planned, we're thinking about things like the MTCR, where the supplier states were the Russians. And so, yeah, it's, I think humbling in many ways, even for, like I said, I wrote a book about North Korea. I spent a lot of time thinking about the North Korean case. the extent to which the North Koreans have, I think, been extremely successful in maneuvering through this moment of great power discord, I think, is just really breathtaking. And that's kind of the story of their history, though. I mean, they are a country that uses these moments of global chaos to really advance their national interests, right? The North Koreans actually, the most painful decade in North Korean history was actually the 1990s, which for the United States is this kind of golden unipolar moment, right? And so the better the world looks for the United States, the worse it is for the North Koreans, and vice versa.
I mean, the two countries we haven't talked about yet is India and Pakistan, and the nuclear dilemma that the two countries face. I mean, how do you rate sort of the deterrent dynamic between those two countries and the possibility of a flare up happening?
Yeah.
I mean, it's not too long ago, in the late '90s, things were very, very tense. The risk of an exchange seemed to be very, very real over the Cargill crisis. But where do those two countries stand right now?
Yeah, so this year was really remarkable, right? May 2025, India and Pakistan fought what some people call a 4-day war or an 88-hour war, and Cargill was obviously very notable for being one of the cases of two nuclear armed countries fighting a conventional war. But what happened this year in May, I think it just bears stating openly, right? It was the most intense multimodal war fighting we've ever seen between two nuclear armed states, right? Air power, mortars, ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, supersonic cruise missiles, cyber attacks, drones between two nuclear armed adversaries. And there's a thesis here that I'm interested in kind of exploring in a lot of my work, and this kind of gets back to the question of technology. During the Kargil War, India and Pakistan are 1 year into their coexistence as nuclear-armed neighbors, overt nuclear-armed neighbors. They had covert capabilities. Before that, they could have broken out, so you had sort of non-weaponized deterrence between the two of them. But Kargil famously had a limit on the use of air power, right? They were not too comfortable with their ability to control escalation. They had very small, vulnerable nuclear forces, vulnerable nuclear command and control capabilities. And so the use of air power was seen as far too risky. Now, more than 25 years into their coexistence as nuclear armed neighbors, there's been a whole lot of nuclear learning between the two sides. They have larger nuclear forces, more survivable nuclear forces, far more robust command and control. And particularly the Indians have better intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance capabilities, better precision strike capabilities. And so it's actually this confidence that comes as a result of all of that, that actually, I think, in part allows the Indians to feel like in May 2025, they can throw some punches in ways that they haven't against the Pakistanis in the nuclear age without transgressing any of Pakistan's red lines. And so the confidence in managing escalation here, and the story that I think both sides have told themselves after this 4-day exchange, is that the space for conventional conflict under the nuclear shadow is a lot greater. And I think that's a very dangerous lesson, even if it worked out this one time. The risk is that the fundamental causes of India-Pakistan skirmishes have not been eliminated, and so we now risk finding ourselves in this third nuclear age in a South Asian situation where India and Pakistan inevitably end up in crises. I mean, just before we recorded this podcast in the last week, there's been two significant terrorist bombings in New Delhi and Islamabad, right? Yeah. And so the sparks for future crises, I think, could set off similar skirmishes, and it's just very disconcerting when you have two countries with nuclear-armed neighbors. So the Indians and Pakistanis, I think, are still entrepreneurs in their own way in terms of pushing the boundaries of what is possible under nuclear deterrence.
We're coming to the tail end of the podcast here, and one of the questions I'd really like to ask you is, how does this nuclear age end, and what does the beginning of the fourth nuclear age look like, if you could forecast out?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. It's one that I actually haven't been asked in any number of the podcasts and book talks I've done here, and it's something I've actually given some thought to. So there's kind of two scenarios that I imagine, right? The first is sort of the Cold War style global transformation moment where the Soviet Union collapses, right? And all of a sudden we're thinking about cooperative threat reduction, securing Soviet weapons, and all of that. And so it's basically this moment, like happy ending, I guess, from the perspective of the United States. Like Xi Jinping and Putin disappear, they're replaced by kind of reformers, or there's some kind of internal revolution. I think that's pretty unlikely, right? Because you're talking about, again, this process of Soviet collapse playing out in two separate civilizations simultaneously. If you talk to subject matter experts, they often will say you might actually get something worse than Vladimir Putin. You might get something worse than Xi Jinping, right? So don't be too confident about that kind of a moment. And then there's the question about the United States itself. Like we might have a moment of kind of national grand strategic change that could also manifest. Like, I talked about if the U.S. changes its nuclear strategy, a lot of the inhibitors at the moment to strategic stability actually become less bad, right? I think a core part. But like, is that a good reason for the U.S. to change? I think is very much a different debate. But the second way it ends is like you actually, you get nuclear use, right? And that's something I really contend with towards the end of my book, because one of the reasons like I work in this field because I really do believe that deterrence it's real, it works, but it's far from perfect. And so the fallibility of nuclear deterrence and the fallibility of nuclear systems, of nuclear organizations around the world, I'm very much kind of in the Scott Sagan school of thought that these complex organizations and bureaucracies that we've sort of set up around the world to manage nuclear weapons aren't going to get things right in perpetuity, and so that's kind of the unintentional pathway to escalation. But there's also like the risk of deliberate use, right? So kind of coercive use in a Taiwan or a Baltic scenario from Russia or China or even the United States, right? If we're more conventionally inferior, and it's just very difficult for me to imagine what the world post third use, right? Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and then third use looks like. But it's also difficult for me to not think of that moment as kind of the transformative one. And either it heralds a world where the fallibility of nuclear deterrence is just kind of revealed and, nuclear deterrence is a lot more precarious, or it alternatively causes this kind of moment of global panic where we recognize that, we got far too close, maybe after limited nuclear use, to full-scale nuclear war, general nuclear war, which again, I have no confidence in the ability to actually prevent general nuclear war after deterrence fails. But that is kind of one of the things, I hope we don't have to find out the answer to. So I'd much prefer that the answer to this question be the first one, where you do get that moment of transformation, either here in the United States, in Russia or China, and, that leads us to a moment where we can get back to that 90s style interregnum where we're able to build institutions internationally and nationally to better control nuclear weapons.
And that is a fairly sobering note on which to end. I think that's going to bring this episode to a close. I want to thank Ankit for joining us today. Thanks as always to Keelan Wolf, Claude Jennings, and the entire NSI staff in helping produce today's episode. Coffee and Conflict is available on Spotify and other fine purveyors of podcasts. This episode will also be available on YouTube and NSI's homepage. Make sure you join us for our next episode in just 2 short weeks. As always, if you like what you've heard or saw, be sure to rate, review, and subscribe. And most importantly, do pick up The New Nuclear Age, which is out now from Polity. It is a fantastic book. It makes a great Christmas present, if I may say so. But Ankit, thanks so much for joining us. It was a fantastic conversation, incredibly thought-provoking.
Thank you, Joshua. I really appreciated it.